Introduction. Any of us can, at times, be me-centered rather than we-centered, in a way that feels not quite right to others or even to ourselves. The most common nickname for this phenomenon of self-centeredness is ego. It's often not pretty in how it shows up, and we may feel ashamed when people call us on having a big ego. But it's possible to notice and feel compassion for whatever fear might lurk beneath our self-importance or selfishness. We can learn not to vilify our ego, but to hold it respectfully and tame it tenderly. The male or female ego then becomes what it is meant to be: a sergeant, not a general, a lady-in-waiting, not a princess. This audiobook is about recognizing our own, at times overblown, ego, whether overt or covert. It's also about how lovable we can become when we let our ego go. We can practice loving kindness and compassion for the egotist inside us and also for the one we may find beside us at work, in our family, in our relationship. We will be working with both psychological and spiritual practices that are carefully designed to move us from ego-driven to love-centered relating. It's a big job, but anyone can learn how to do it, and we're guaranteed to find the graces necessary to help it happen. The ego is healthy when it helps us fulfill our life goals. When an ego becomes too big for its britches, it becomes egotism, what is called a big ego. We may find egotistical behavior objectionable and unjustified. Our style in this audiobook, however, will not be to demean egotists. We get it that their swagger is based on self-doubt, fear, and shame. Charles Blow, in Fire Shut Up in My Bones, refers to two ego styles: those seeking to enshrine their swagger and those seeking to compensate for their lack of it. So, although we don't like egotistical behavior or attitudes, we can still feel compassion for what led to that ego armoring in the first place. We can feel the tragedy of a permanently defensive ego that elbows people out of its way and grabs all it can for itself. Such a style is based on an illusory belief that there aren't enough resources to go around. That sense of scarcity is the suspicion or fear that I have to get mine since I can't trust that what I need will be given to me. There won't be enough to go around. I won't get what's rightfully coming to me. We can easily see how these beliefs show a lack of trust in the abundance life can offer. Our fear of not getting enough might go back to a childhood in which we were emotionally deprived, so we lost trust that what we needed would come our way from those around us. Our only options seem to be me first and I have to take care of me since no one else will. Most of us have encountered an egotistical person who displays an off-putting demand that he be the center of attention, that he dominate people and circumstances. Such a style is usually traceable to a wound from childhood. Here are 5 common examples. When we were not given loving attention, our wound is neglect by those who are supposed to be attentive to us. When we were not allowed to have personal power, our wound has to do with being controlled or having our spirit squelched. When the wound was being judged as wrong, bad, or inadequate, we might have imbibed this belief about ourselves. I don't measure up. I have to keep proving myself as worthy. When the wound was being excluded, scorned, or shame, we might now believe, I don't fit in. I'm on the margin, looking in. When the wound was being isolated, deserted, betrayed, we might suppose, I have no one I can really rely on. It's all up to me. Under the bravado and bluster of egotism is a raw sensitivity that has arisen out of hurts like these. But instead of responding to hurt with an ouch or with grief, an egotist might respond by stuffing the pain and then compensating with his arrogant, look-good attitudes and behaviors. This is why the chest-thumping ego is the great imposter. In reality, egotists have very fragile egos, something women seem to recognize easily in so many men. The arrogant ego is not a separate entity or part of our brain. It's a mindset, an attitude, a word that itself has come to be associated with big ego. A mindset is a fixed set of beliefs with which we interpret or respond to a situation or person. The mindset of the inflated ego called egotism is the me-first attitude, familiar and unappealing to all of us. In healthy pride, on the other hand, we appreciate our gifts and want to share them, not show them off. Healthy refers to what is sane, wholesome, and mature in us. In classic psychology, ego is the executive activity of our personality, at times functional, at times dysfunctional. The phrase big ego is not our actual ego, it's only an attitude and set of behaviors that ego has espoused and to which it has become attached. Ego as a function becomes ego as what we are. The egotistical mindset, attitude, is our topic in this audiobook. We'll call it ego at times because that's the common usage, but what we're actually talking about is egotism, a self-centered set of attitudes and behaviors that shows up as arrogance and entitlement. This ego mindset presents a defensive attitude when confronted or even questioned. This often leads to aggressive behavior. Ego's sense of entitlement gives it permission to show that aggression in the form of revenge, ego's favorite sport. So, an egotist is not fun to be around. A pompous ego seems mostly male in its demeanor, aggressive, in your face. But women show ego also, as divas and female vanity remind us. Egotism is present in both sexes, but expressed differently in each. A man might swagger to show he's boss. A woman might strut her stuff to show how easily men fall prey to her charms. Likewise, a man may boastfully proclaim, "I'm independent and don't want to be married." Then a woman's ego may be challenged. "I have more going for me than other women do, so I can change his mind." We've all heard the expression, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." That inclination toward revenge is frightening indeed to anyone in its path. We see this not only when a woman perceives that she's rejected or replaced. It also appears in competitive behaviors among women. The stepmother queen, in the story of Snow White, is the archetypal figure of envy regarding the beauty of rival females and the dangerous consequences of a woman's belief in her right to revenge. The vain, conceited ego, in either sex, is a disability when it comes to forming healthy relationships, both at home and at work. The real culprit in so many failed relationships is ego. Just as a physical disability cramps our range of motion, an arrogant ego limits our range of cooperation and mutuality. Intimacy can only breathe in an atmosphere of ever-increasing openness, admitted and amended shortcomings, continual forgiveness, generously mended failures, willingly repaired disruptions. None of that can happen on planet ego. We've all heard the expression, looking for love in all the wrong places. We might say that an ego attitude and behavior is looking for love in all the wrong ways. Egotistical behavior and attitudes can drive people away. Yet, it is possible to move from an isolated ego style to authentic connection and mutuality. Indeed, the opposite of ego attitude is its remedy, a loving attitude towards self and others too. Erich Fromm, in The Art of Loving, writes, "Love is an attitude which is the same toward all, including myself." When the inflated ego insists on superiority instead of equality with others, it misses out even on fulfilling its own goal to love itself effectively. I don't know how to be selfish in an effective way. We're so concerned with protecting our turf that we lose sight of our real goal in life, to give and receive love. When we come across with a grandiose ego attitude, it becomes hard for others to love us, though they may feel sorry for us. When we show the best of our true nature, all-inclusive gentle love, we become lovable. Letting go of an egotistical attitude is thus how we love ourselves best, because by that letting go, we open to the love of others, which is what we really want, what we always wanted. Learning to let go of egotism in favor of the egolessness that love requires of us means we'll have to be on the alert, since ego lurks in our attitudes and behaviors often unnoticed. Our affirmation, therefore, has to be, I choose to be aware of every cunning trick of ego. I am here to experience real love in my life. I won't let the old sly pickpocket rob me of my chance for intimacy. Maintaining an ego stance in life is a form of suffering because the egotistical attitude is so constrictive that we always have to be on guard. We are watching out for even the slightest slur against our greatness. Our style in this audiobook is not to ridicule ego or put it down. Instead, it is to show compassion for our own ego and that of others. We see how its posturings are futile attempts to protect its vulnerability. We understand that a blustering ego is in pain. We empathize with the need behind the defenses. Our compassion for egotism is a recognition of a desperate and mistaken clinging to defenses for protection, when defenselessness is actually what works best. As we trust ourselves more, we begin letting go of our defenses. Then our vulnerability no longer feels dangerous. It has become open-heartedness. We soon trust the world, too, a consequence we see in this quotation from The Mind of Absolute Trust by Sun Tzu. When we are in harmony with all that is, then our self-centeredness vanishes, and with it, every trace of self-doubt. Now we trust the universe completely. When we imagine that our armor of ego defenses is who we are, all we are, we're caught in a case of mistaken identity. It's an orientation of thinking and acting that's based on faulty beliefs about ourselves, some primitive from our Cro-Magnon ancestors, some recent from family and society. The fact that an egotistical style is really only a mindset, no matter how deeply ingrained, can give us hope, because a mindset can be changed. we can still take the high ground rather than succumb to the low. We can transcend our biological heritage. We can locate a power beyond our ego. We are not what we think we are when ego is our only identity. Egolessness is in us, and when we find it, we embark on the path to true self-esteem and generous love for others and ourselves. There is no separate self, but there is this life of ours, this presence that is ourselves, individual and connected to all beings. Ego's journey is from being all there is to being all for all. Courageous people have come along in history to show us how to be generous and powerful, but without ego attitude. Jesus, St. Francis, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, and many more who were not famous at all. They were all moved by a vision of an alternative to our primitive default style of aggression. They saw that change from ego-centered to others-centered living was possible, and they lived that way. They saw that the genetic propensity toward egocentricity only seems fixed. Our wisdom endowment from our ancestor teachers and from among our own acquaintances is ever expanding as new visionaries and helpers keep appearing. It will be up to us to evolve into beings who look like Buddha in loving kindness, like Christ in willing sacrifice, like Mother Teresa in compassionate caring, like our Aunt Lucy in selfless generosity. In this audiobook, our style will not be judgmental, but developmental. We will explore how our egotism came to be and how it can be worked with so it can be transformed and take its rightful place as a healthy part of our life experience. This means being willing to become intimate with our egotistical style in all its recondite and embarrassing details. When we do that, we'll be able to find what is best in it and put it to use to build courage and intimacy rather than to diminish them. In my own life, I came to realize that a sincere spiritual path necessarily includes letting go of ego-centeredness. Spirituality calls for a continual surrender of ego rather than looking for ways to endorse, fortify, or reinforce it. Surrender implies reduction of the ego's power, undermining of its pathetic illusions of grandeur and unfounded claims to superiority. But we can discover the joy of being set free from its grasp. I knew I had become more spiritually conscious when I started welcoming comments that pointed out how my ego was rearing its ugly head, when I finally stopped defending my ego and wanted to know how to see it and tame it. Then it became more of a tool. And indeed, a proud ego mindset does come in handy at times. Several years ago, I went with a friend to see the film 7 Years in Tibet. As we were leaving the theater, I said to her, "The Brad Pitt character certainly had a big ego, didn't he?" She wisely replied, "That's the only kind of ego that could have rescued the Dalai Lama from Tibet." I instantly realized she was right and said so. That's why it's not a good idea to eliminate ego attitude altogether. We bring it out when appropriate and useful. We can learn just when to show it and when to leave it behind. The Irish golf pro Rory McIlroy stated it well. "You know, I need that cockiness, the self-belief, arrogance, swagger, whatever you want to call it. I need that on the golf course to bring the best out of myself. Once I leave the golf course, that all gets left there." Rory McIlroy's swagger refers to the proud stance an athlete assumes on a playing field. This posture says, I am seriously into this and I'm ready and competent. This style increases players' self-confidence and does indeed make for their playing a better game. It's an example of how ego posturing can be useful. All we have to keep in mind is that it works on the field, but not so well in the bedroom, living room, or anywhere else you want to make room for love. There's another important reference to ego in the film 7 Years in Tibet. This one balances the realization my friend had. In a marketplace, the Brad Pitt character, Heinrich Harrer, who had been an Olympic champion, finds an old newspaper with a picture of him receiving a sports award. He proudly shows it to Pema, a Tibetan woman friend. She responds by pointing out that in the West, accomplishment and victory matter, while in the East, it's letting go of ego that matters. This is our greatest spiritual accomplishment, and a gold prize indeed. The style of this audiobook is to combine respect for ego as a useful but seldom needed tool, and compassion for the ego that fears what it most wants, and thus goes so far astray from the love it seeks. We work gently with this scared part of ourselves and others. We don't abandon our ego, we rehabilitate it. We see the self-inflation, the prancing, the strut and swagger in ourselves and others, and are touched by the pathos and pain behind it. Compassion toward ego helps dissolve its aggressive exterior and release the core of gentle goodness, the true strength that has always been under it, our true nature beyond ego, an indelible, inviolable, and unconditional core of goodness, love, and humility, unmarred by our history, unhindered by our fears. Ego is a shell, and it's under a spell. It's a shell of defenses constructed over a lifetime. Ego will always want to take over, to win, to be on top. Ego resists saying yes to the givens of every life, accepting the truth about ourselves, taking our place in life's ever-changing lineup rather than always being first, sometimes needing feedback or help, or allowing ourselves to need someone. Regarding this last point, I recently listened to a radio interview of a man who sold his home and spent the next year traveling. He was asked, "What did you notice about yourself as a world traveler?" He responded, "Travel helped me have less ego, since I didn't know languages or my way around and had to ask for help, something I'm too proud to do at home." Our journey in life is toward noticing and manifesting the indissoluble wholeness within us, who we are beyond our ego mindsets. Every time we open ourselves, or are opened by someone or something, every time we reveal ourselves, every time we let ourselves be vulnerable, we chip away at our hard shell. Our life is one long process, either of reinforcing our shell or chipping away at it. Ego is under a spell because it's a compulsion. We can't help acting from it. It's a reflex. It's an automatic reactiveness to any challenge to our conceit or entitlements. After all, ego, not yet free to make a variety of choices, has to uphold an image of itself as always right, is always in control, especially of feelings. Life does not have to be hard. One of the things that makes it hard is the trapped energy in an arrogant ego mindset. But the elements of ego that support that mindset can be dissolved in favor of true human power. Our work is to tame our ego, not to kill it off. The ego dies at death. There's no need to kill it beforehand. We want to dismantle, not destroy. We want neither to eliminate it nor to hold on to it. We simply want to be free of its grip and out of its clutches. If we learn to do that, we can then take all that ego has gathered and gained to puff itself up, and we can reinvest that into healthy self-esteem and generous love. Our lifelong task is thus nothing less than the painstaking and joyously liberating disassembling of ego. Nothing less is required for our full emergence than the total demolition of ego become egotism. When this happens, we finally emerge from the shame that built that fortress in which we were condemned to hide. This happens through continual letting go of self-centeredness in favor of all-centeredness. It happens through surrender of entitlements one by one, while maintaining reasonable acknowledgement of our rights and limits too. It happens through arduous attempt after more arduous attempt at breaking ourselves of our long-standing compulsion to be in control of ourselves and others. What choices, what path will help tame my ego? This can become the criterion by which we make our choices in life and relationships. Our goal is to move from self-centered ego to unitive consciousness, full entry into the oneness of the web of life. The ego mindset limits our scope of presence and our field of relating. The less ego in control, the more flexible is our sense of who we are in the world of others, since we feel less privileged and more collaborative. We are not then privateers, but argosies of generosity. The motivation to let go of the ego attitude is not found in the recommendations of a Psychology 101 textbook. It takes a spiritual awakening. Psychological work does not get us there. The desire to demote the ego usually requires the touch of grace. Ego is not powerful enough to free itself. A special gift, grace, comes our way from beyond ego effort. It points us in the direction of love rather than fear, of allowing rather than controlling, of being open rather than being right, of being in the here and now rather than residing in the patterns we lug around from our Cro-Magnon past. When the fox of ego has been coaxed out of hiding, he can bow to an exciting new possibility, a life of openness and opening. We can live wholeheartedly, that is, occupy the here and now with our entire presence, not just with our ego. Our direct experience will then no longer be hijacked by old habit patterns. Unfortunately, the path to freedom from egotism is not neatly or clearly laid out. We will have to do what knights did when they searched for the Holy Grail. Enter a forest in which there's no clearly marked path. We will have to engage in some bushwhacking. We will often think we're lost, often find ourselves without a compass, often without a light, but never without an ally. Unitive consciousness, beyond ego, is more than a sense of support. It gives us a sense of alliance, of accompaniment. Indeed, innumerable saints and bodhisattvas, including our own ancestors, are gathering around us even now as we decide it's worthwhile to embark on the voyage to egolessness, the port of love. So we are not alone. others have given up ego too, and we are now in that sterling lineage. Doffing the ego's safe glory, he finds his naked reality. Dag Hammarskjöld, Markings. Chapter 1. What is ego? Too often we honor swagger and bluster and wielders of force. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of others. Robert F. Kennedy, on the mindless menace of violence. A speech given at the City Club of Cleveland on April 5, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Ego is simply the Latin word for I. In traditional psychology, the ego is the ordering principle of our personality. It is the executive function of our psyche, the part of us that carries out what helps us reach our life goals. The healthy ego has the capacity to observe, judge, and choose. It also establishes a strong sense of personal continuity, giving coherence to our life story, stability to our lives. It's our hale and hearty ego that makes relating effective. This ego is usually equated with the self, our enduring sense of a unique identity. This is the conscious personality self that has and processes experience. The self-ego, described in psychology, is not an ontological entity. It's a process, ever-changing, operational, not metaphysical. We can see how the strongly individualistic ego emerged over the centuries. From the time of the origin of our species, nerve circuits helped us coordinate our movements and soon stored memories and impressions so we could move safely and productively in the world. As we learned to predict outcomes based on past experience, our executive functions became stronger. The more we knew about how we and the world worked, the better equipped we were to handle the challenges of daily life, and the better we became at surviving. The name for all these powers in us is ego. When ego powers work in favor of mutual survival, they're contributions. When they work to institute personal sovereignty over others, they become threatening, not a healthy atmosphere for the love we are here to give and be. Our sense of self is based on actions, attitudes, and personal history. When our belief is that we are superior and privileged rather than equal, our sense of self does not reflect the union of the human family. It has become tied to rugged individualism, which easily leads to arrogance. The arrogance of egotism or selfishness is based on an illusion that the world revolves around us and on an exaggerated opinion of our self-worth or skill level. Our world is only safe when we recognize that we are all unique, but also all connected. Teamwork is an antidote to egotism. And of course, ego is not the captain of the team, only a player. What egotism looks like. The first reform must be in attitude. Pope Francis, interview with Antonio Spadaro, S.J., in America, September 30th, 2013. In the early 19th century, the word ego referred only to the thinking, conscious mind. Later in that century, the word came to be associated with conceit. Then, ego took on the meaning of excessive pride, putting oneself front and center, self-absorption, self-obsession. This is egotism, what can get in the way of personal development, successful relationships, and spiritual growth. This is what needs to be identified in our behavior so that we can find ways to tame it, and so that its energy can be used to nurture us, strengthen our relationships, and contribute to our spiritual evolution. Egotism means sizing up everything in accord with furthering our own interests. Egotism is the opposite of altruism, which focuses on how others might benefit from our choices and actions. Carl Jung wrote in his commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, when Freud coined the phrase that the ego was the true seat of anxiety, he was giving voice to a very true and profound intuition. Fear of self-sacrifice lurks deep in every ego. Likewise, brain science shows that the isolation the egotist feels as people distance themselves from him is actually a form of stress and reduces longevity. In fact, dopamine, a stress-reducing hormone in our reward circuit, becomes activated when we go beyond self-concern to help others. We move away from every man for himself to all for one and one for all. Indeed, we were made to be with others. It's the foundation of our sense of belonging. We are relational whether or not we're in an intimate relationship. Each of us is more than an individual ego I. Each of us is a cell in the one mystical body of humanity. Indeed, awareness of connection activates the cortex of the brain to inhibit inclinations toward hate and division. The word egotism refers to excessive self-reference, arrogance with boastfulness. Self-centeredness is a natural part of our existence as beings intent on surviving. It becomes a handicap to healthy relating when it leads us to pull rank, look down on others, or act in self-serving ways. We also use the word egoism. Here, the emphasis is on valuing things in accordance with one's own self-interest, but not necessarily calling attention to it in a boastful way. Egoism is about taking care of number one. Egotism is insisting on being number one. Egoism might be quiet. Egotism is loud. The little pig who calmly made his house of bricks is an egoist. The big bad wolf who huffs and puffs is an egotist. We notice which one survived. Appropriate pride and self-caring comprise healthy selfishness. They don't cancel our sense of others' needs as egotism does. In personal pride, an athlete might say, "It did not help my ego to make so many errors in the game." This is not conceit, but a realization that doing our best is important to our self-esteem. Egotism, our topic, is associated with the word hubris. This refers to arrogance, elitism, an overly proud manner, refusal to admit a need for anyone's help. The ancient Greeks used the word hubris to refer to excessive or exaggerated pride based on a presumption of superiority. A person with hubris was also one who ascribed his successes only to himself without acknowledging the help of the gods. Aeschylus warned in The Persians, "Zeus on high comes down hard on arrogance and boastfulness." So hubris was dangerous, since the gods were known for their habits of revenge against those who refused to honor them. The person with hubris could expect a downfall, a comeuppance, a punishment. how clear it is that the ancient gods were made in the image of the worst in the human ego. We're tempted to ask if the Judeo-Christian biblical sense of God is likewise a reflection of the punitive ego. Thus, in the Greek world, hubris was followed inescapably by nemesis, downfall. We see this same pairing in the biblical book of Proverbs. Pride leads to destruction, and arrogance to downfall. Chapter 16, verse 18. A big ego can remain hidden until the stimulus comes along that arouses it. A person on the outside is the nicest guy in the world, but the minute he is offended or made to lose face, his shadow side comes out. In a relationship, for instance, a partner might be easy to get along with, but when he's crossed, hurt, or betrayed, he can be severely vindictive, the characteristic of a big ego that's lethal to intimacy. In some people, on the other hand, a big ego is not so covert. It can be spotted easily, fully visible in daily interactions. Words we use to show how egotism comes across include the following: attitude, conceited, boastful, arrogant, smug, vain, haughty, pretentious, supercilious, self-righteous, self-important, self-aggrandizing, self-centered, self-involved, self-absorbed, stuck-up, snobbish, snooty, condescending, patronizing, puffed up, pompous, grandiose, superior, uppity, blustering, showing off, posturing, swaggering, strutting. Another word associated with ego is vainglory. Ego is what causes us to regard ourselves as God's gift to humanity. Vainglory is excessive pride and boastfulness, often pompous, because of one's successes and achievements. Its definition carries the specific sense that the glory itself is vain, that is, useless for healthy growth. From the preceding, we've heard some of the major disabilities of a big ego. It can't admit, submit, remit, or commit. That is to say, an egotist cannot admit he's wrong or apologize. He has to be in charge, so he cannot submit to someone else's idea or plan. He cannot remit wrongs, that is, forgive and let go. He has to get back at the other, especially if he's been made to lose face. He cannot commit to a truly healthy give-and-take relationship. These are not choices, they're compulsions. This is why compassion, not blame, is the appropriate response to a big ego in others. At the same time, these are obstacles to intimacy, so we need to be careful about entering a relationship with someone whose ego is out of control and over the top. Phrases we use to describe an egotist: too big for his britches, on her high horse, thinks he's a big shot, thinks she walks on water, sits in judgment, puts on airs, comes across as high and mighty, has a swelled head, alpha male, macho, diva, princess, prima donna, smart aleck, on an ego trip, 100% male ego. Inflated ego beliefs. I am above other people. I deserve special treatment. I'm never in the wrong, so I never have to apologize. I'm never wrong, so I can't be corrected. When I am offended, I don't forgive, I only demand redress or retaliate. Others have obligations to me, but not vice versa. I can't own the impact of my behavior on others because I'm so caught up in defending my position. Others are either of use to me or competitors. I have to look out for number one, even at the expense of others. There's no such thing as good enough. It has to be perfect. We are too big to fail. Personality traits of an egotist is controlling, bullying, or manipulative in relationships, feels entitled to special treatment, has a cutthroat competitive style, engaging in one-upmanship at work or home, insists that everything has to be quid pro quo, win-lose, survival of the fittest, thinks I'm entitled to get all I need no matter what others lose or are deprived of. I'm up, so pull up the ladder. Is territorial, demanding, this is mine, stay off of my turf. Makes no distinction or pause between I want it and it's mine. Responds in a hypersensitive way to criticism. Even the most gentle feedback, good-humored comments, reasonable recommendations are taken as criticism. Is highly critical of others. Cannot tolerate being disagreed with or shown to have been mistaken, unable, inferior, or wrong. Cannot apologize or forgive. Cannot stand being in a group as just anybody, rather than the most important person present, the center of attention, the one with pride of place. For instance, an ego-centered person might resent waiting in line with ordinary people, rather than being served first as befits his station. Feels continual status anxiety, and therefore needs to be continually reaffirmed by everyone. Cannot compromise, sometimes not even negotiate. Believes that maintaining one's position is more important than happiness or connection. Ego getting its way or saving its face trumps love, relationship, money, integrity, even life, as Shakespeare says in Troilus and Cressida. Holds honor far more precious dear than life. Defends his or her honor for reasons that are often the same as defending the ego. Is vindictive when hurt or thwarted in any way, spiteful, unable to forgive, and certainly not able to forget. Can hold a grudge for a lifetime. Is enraged when unable to get away with something or outed in any way. Has a defensive reply and an excuse even when caught red-handed. Is able to lie about things easily. Runs roughshod over others' feelings without recognizing their pain or needs. Looks down on others no matter what their status. Arrogance thrives on comparison, hence, I am above or better than other people. Feels disdain for those considered less than. Secretly or openly rejoices at the downfall or blunders of others. Cannot ask for help or receive it, no matter how well meant or necessary. Cannot admit having a need of anything from others, and thus refuses to be grateful, or cannot feel grateful to anyone. Insists on organization and order. Feels stressed by conflict or change of her routine. This is why everything has to go and be my way. Cannot smile at his own mistakes. What permissions does an egotist believe he has? Based on his sense of entitlement, the egotist believes he has the right to engage in any form of payback, to claim an exemption from the givens of life, for example, that sometimes relationships change or end without our wanting them to do so, to dominate and decide a course of action without regard for the preferences of others, to cheat, lie, or engage in corrupt and unethical practices, especially when he's given power, for example, in a responsible job. To take over, take first place, take the most, take all. What is most likely underneath all of the beliefs and behaviors we've just described? The list that follows suggests the thoughts that actually underlie the egotist's beliefs and personality traits, and suggest reasons for compassion toward the egotist. My ego is fragile. My self-esteem is tenuous. I live with a gnawing sense of inferiority. I am full of self-doubt. I feel I am not as good as others. I can fail or fall apart at any time. I am terrified of not being liked or loved. I am afraid of having anyone see I'm not all I'm cracked up to be. I'm afraid that people will see the side of myself that can embarrass me. I dread losing my reputation, not looking good in the eyes of others, or not maintaining my positive image. I may not be acknowledged as much as I require. My views may not be acknowledged as superior. I may not get away with dishonesty or phoniness. My entitlements may not be honored. I may have to be like everyone else, not first or special. I may not get an exemption from the givens of life. I can't let my anger show, so I'm often passive-aggressive, showing anger while covering it up at the same time. I may not be properly respected, so I will feel shame, the sense of being defective. Shame, isolation, and fear thus lurk behind the flamboyance of a grandiose ego. Shame from early life can go into hiding and come out as narcissism later. We can look at shame, isolation, and fear in more detail. Shame is a sense of unworthiness about ourselves in relation to others. Deep connection requires full visibility, a letting go of shame about being who we are, no matter how inadequate we may feel. But that requires too much vulnerability when shame lurks within us. In the healthy alternative to shame, our self-disclosure to those we trust gives us a sense of belonging. We can choose to be open about who we are. Then, our worthiness is a decision we make, not an ignominy we believe we deserve. Shame isolates us. It causes us to feel different from and not as good as others, disconnected, excluded. Thus, there's a sense of desolation and isolation behind egotism. The egotistical belief that I am all there is implies that we have no visible or invisible means of support. This attitude makes the isolation even more desolate. Indeed, egotism is isolation. The fear behind an egotistical manner is usually invisible, even to the ego itself. We don't recognize that fear generates our ego reactions. We don't see how they're defensive. We imagine they are fully justified, straightforward responses to others' behavior. We may come across as strong, but in reality, it's fragility masquerading as strength. Papier-mâché made to look like steel. The ego is the great pretender, continually overcompensating for his inadequacies. I found this comment online by the actor and director Ben Affleck. I'm always described as cocksure or with a swagger, but that bears no resemblance to who I feel like inside. I feel plagued by insecurity. We're all plagued in that way, but it takes healthy humility to admit it, a big step toward the letting go of ego attitude. Finally, we notice that there's no mention of malice and hate in the description of an egotist. Mean-spiritedness is a separate issue. It's not generated by ordinary egotism. It arises from sociopathy, misanthropy, a long history of abuse by others, or a proclivity to hate and keep hating. An egotist is not necessarily malicious. It is the wounded, indignant ego attitude in us that hates. Hate is seething, ill-willed anger with an insatiable need for revenge. We can't harm the one who hurt us enough. Shakespeare refers to this trait of hate in Othello. Had all his hairs been lives, my great revenge had stomach for them all. Finding the positive uses of ego. Here's a short summary of the traits of egotism, followed by some ways they can become useful. An egotist thinks, acts, and is motivated selfishly, comes across with arrogance, maintains a sense of entitlement, believes he is superior to others, whether or not he has the commensurate level of skill or accomplishment to justify it, envies others' success, is vindictive if crossed, unacknowledged, accused, insulted, mistreated, contradicted, or made to lose face, that is, embarrassed in front of others. Each egotistical trait can serve to boost our psychological and spiritual health if it is worked with in other ways. We can think, act, and be motivated by altruism, come across with humility, have a sense of fair play and human rights, our own and those of others, say ouch and open to dialogue rather than retaliating if crossed, unacknowledged, accused, insulted, or mistreated. Admire accomplished people and be happy about their success. Grow in self-esteem, but without looking down on others. One day when I was working on this chapter, a client told me his goal in life and relationships was to have less ego and more self-esteem. I was struck by how easily he summarized my entire book. And I want to have those very same two goals in my own life. The words we use. Without egotism in the world, some words and terms would not have the same role in our vocabulary. For instance, affront, indignation, turf, rank, saving face. We can look at each of them. It is a given of life that people sometimes insult us, and the natural response is hurt. But to be affronted or to become indignant is the reaction of a self-inflated ego whose overblown sense of its own invincible greatness has been bruised. If our ego did not become aroused, we might treat an insult more matter-of-factly. With an appropriate-sized ego, we might simply say, ouch, and open a dialogue. We can then be firmly assertive without being vindictive as a follow-up to indignation. We will fight back, but not hurt back. We will seek redress, but not revenge. We will not engage in payback, because we accept the given that sometimes people step on our toes. But we're able to treat that as we do while dancing, with a good-hearted shrug, not with a reaction of indignant anger. This is what is meant by equanimity and even temper, a virtuous antidote to egotism. An example of a word that takes on a special meaning when egotism's boots are on the ground is turf. A swollen ego finds its safety and security in staking a claim to its turf and a consequent stubborn possessiveness. Without egotism, we would be able to have possessions and maintain our right to them, but we wouldn't have to be on guard or have to keep reaffirming our ownership. As a cyclist, I can relate a very specific example of the male sense of turf. Sometimes, as I ride in the legal bike lane to the left of parked cars and to the curb behind them, a male pedestrian is crossing toward that curb. I am crossing in front of him. More than once, I've heard a man grumble under his breath, "Damn bikes!" I've noticed, and appreciate, by the way, that in instances like this, I've never seen a woman react as men do. In my experience, women have taken the scene in stride. I understand that, to some males, my behavior is a mild equivalent of cutting someone off in traffic, which certainly can arouse the big ego reaction called road rage. I've learned to pedal around the back of male pedestrians so that I do not cross what they consider their rightful turf to any part